You're listening to The Drag.
I'm Katie Pinchakautka, and this is Forsaken. This episode is about Anthony Graves, a man who spent years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. Aisling Ayers speaks with death row experts and Anthony himself about the experiences of those spending time on Texas death row and the toll it takes on them.
In the midst of cold calls and emails to sources about Rodney Reed's case, I kept receiving the same question. Have you talked to Anthony Graves? I'd never even heard Anthony's name before, and I didn't know anything about him. I was so focused on Rodney. Everyone had something to say about that case, and it seemed like I was always discovering something new. But Anthony's name kept coming up, again and again and again. So I looked him up. He'd been cited as an expert in articles about Rodney, and he even completed a brief for Rodney's Supreme Court case. But what really took me by surprise was what I saw when I scrolled down a little further. That he had been wrongfully convicted of a gruesome crime in the 90s. Only 16 people have ever been exonerated from Texas death row after being convicted and sentenced to die. Anthony Graves is one of them. After looking into his case, I knew I had to talk to him. We emailed back and forth a couple of times, and I eventually spoke to him on the phone. He quickly agreed to an interview. So in October of 2022, my executive producer Katie Autka and I hit the road. We grabbed a few breakfast tacos and drove the 3 hours east from Austin to Houston. Honestly, I was nervous. On our drive, I remember asking Katie how I should even go about interviewing someone who spent over a decade of their life sitting on death row for a crime he didn't commit. I'm a 22-year-old who just graduated from college. I don't have any life experiences that even begin to relate to that. How could I try to understand his story, to empathize with him? When we got there, we took the elevator up to the 11th floor of the Harris County Public Defender's Office. It's where Anthony works as the Director of Public Outreach. He met us in the hallway and led us back to his office. It was airy and bright, with framed awards and memorabilia hung on every wall. A huge window looked out over Minute Maid Park, where the Houston Astros play baseball. Katie and I sat down in 2 armchairs across from his desk, admiring the space. He wore a bright pink button-up shirt, and he had a warm smile. Posters with inspirational quotes and bolded words like perseverance and hope hung behind him. It was hard to imagine that the man sitting at the grand wooden desk in front of me had nearly spent 2 decades of his life in a cell. It wasn't lost on me that his office was far bigger than the prison cells that he spent 18 years of his life in. We had hardly finished miking him up when he began to tell his story.
My case is I was wrongfully convicted. I was wrongfully convicted of a heinous murder in a small town in Somerville, Texas. 6 people were murdered. They were shot, stabbed, bludgeoned to death. Gasoline was poured all over their bodies, and the house was burned down.
The story you're about to hear comes from my own research, reporting, and interviews, as well as the reporting of journalist Pamela Koloff, who interviewed Anthony multiple times for Texas Monthly. On August 18th, 1992, police arrived at the burning home of Bobby Davis, a 45-year-old school employee in Somerville, Texas. Somerville's a town about 90 miles northwest of Houston, In 1992, the population was around 1,500 people. The Davis family was black, and the one-story brick home stood on the so-called black side of the Somerville railroad tracks that divided the town by race. And that summer night, firefighters walked in on a gruesome scene. They found Bobby's body near the front door in the living room. She'd been stabbed at least 29 times in the head and bludgeoned with a blunt object. Down the hallway, they found Bobby's 16-year-old daughter, Nicole, and Nicole's niece, 9-year-old Denitra. Nicole had been shot 5 times in the head and chest, and she and Denitra had both been stabbed. As authorities moved through the house, they found the bodies of Bobby's 3 other grandchildren: 6-year-old Brittany, 5-year-old Leerin, and 4-year-old Jason. They'd all been stabbed between 7 and 13 times. Collectively, the bodies were stabbed 66 times, as well as shot and bludgeoned. Whoever killed them poured gasoline over their bodies, setting both them and the house aflame. Police and volunteer firefighters arrived on the scene that night. The next morning, the Texas Rangers got there too. They're essentially statewide law enforcement officers who work on major crimes. The fire had destroyed the crime scene and most of the evidence. There wasn't a clear suspect, and the initial investigation led nowhere. Four days after the murders, hundreds of people from Somerville gathered in the town's high school gymnasium to attend the family's funeral. Then one man arrived with most of his face and hands wrapped in thick, white bandages. His name was Robert Carter, and he was the father of 4-year-old Jason Davis, the youngest murder victim. People who knew Carter described him as being very quiet, a man who kept to himself. The family situation here is a little complicated, so let me try to explain it in the simplest terms possible. Carter shared his son, Jason, with Lisa Davis, who was Bobby Davis's daughter. Lisa should have been at the house the night of the murders, but she'd taken an extra shift at work. Now, she grieved the loss of her son, Jason, as well as her daughter from a previous relationship, 9-year-old Denitra. Lisa and Carter weren't married, and in fact, Lisa had even filed a paternity suit against Carter 4 days before the murders. But that day at the funeral, she tried to embrace Carter. They had just lost their son. When she saw his bandages, she asked what happened, but Carter just turned and walked away. Several other people at the funeral also approached Carter, trying to express their sadness for the loss of his son. Naturally, they asked him about his bandages. At the time, Carter was married to a woman named Cookie, and according to reporter Pamela Koloff, Cookie stepped into a conversation at the funeral to defend her husband. She said he got the second-degree burns from a lawnmower catching fire. A team of Texas Rangers were also among the funeral goers that day, and without any leads so far, Carter's bandages made him the person of interest that they were waiting for. After the funeral, they showed up at his home and took him in for questioning. The .22 pistol that Carter usually kept above his bed was missing, and the Rangers found a box of bullets that matched the same kind used to shoot 16-year-old Nicole. Carter denied any involvement in the murders, but he failed a polygraph exam soon after. And 14 hours of questioning later, he finally agreed to make a statement. He admitted to being present at the scene of the crime, but put the blame on someone else. first, he said the name was Kenneth, then corrected himself. It was Anthony. Anthony Graves, his wife's first cousin. That's who did it. He started to tell the Rangers that sometime after 1 a.m. on the night of the murders, Anthony and Carter were driving around. When Anthony asked Carter if there were any women he could get with, Carter said he thought of Nicole Davis, the 16-year-old daughter of Bobby. So he told the Rangers that he drove Anthony to the Davis home. Even though Anthony had never met a member of the Davis family, and Carter's own 4-year-old son was sleeping inside. Carter said that he waited in the car while Anthony went inside. Then, he said he heard screaming and ran into the house. He said he saw Anthony murdering the family, then watched as Anthony doused the house in gasoline. Carter said he got caught in the flames, and that's what left him with the second-degree burn wounds on his face and hands. He then drove Anthony back to his home in a nearby town and dropped him off. When questioned, he said he wasn't angry at Anthony, even though he had just told the Rangers that Anthony had murdered his son. The taped conversations reveal that the Rangers focused on urging Carter to identify another accomplice, but really didn't question him on how and why Anthony would have wanted to single-handedly murder a house full of strangers. The 3 murder weapons were a gun, a knife, and a hammer. Investigators argued that no one person could have carried this crime out alone. So when the name and story of Anthony was presented to the Rangers, they stopped questioning Carter on his own role in the murders altogether.
The next morning they came to my home, officer. I ended up going down to the police station with them because they wanted to talk to me. And from there, I was read my rights and charged with capital murder without any investigation of my whereabouts.
In Texas, a murder is considered a capital murder if it meets certain criteria. In this case, it was because the victims were under the age of 10 and because the murders happened at the same time as another criminal offense, arson. Capital murder is punishable by life in prison or the death penalty. And it's the only crime in Texas for which someone can be sentenced to death. I asked Anthony why Carter gave his name to the Texas Rangers that day. Even though Cookie was Anthony's cousin, Anthony hardly knew Carter, and he had never even met the Davis family. Close friends of Cookie and Carter would later confirm this, and they said that they never once saw Anthony at the couple's house or his car parked in the driveway, that he wasn't one of their friends. Anthony told me that when the Texas Rangers drove Carter to the DPS, Carter thought he saw Anthony drive by. Anthony thinks this moment caused Carter to blurt out his name when the Rangers asked him later.
He was married to a cousin of mine who I had grew up with. And because we had grew up together, I guess she talked about her family tree. But he, probably right now, me and you talking, you've talked to me more than he had ever talked to me in his life. But because he was married to my cousin and he knew her family, and yes, I guess he thought that was me in the Jeep and he called. But they found out that was not me in the Jeep. It didn't matter to them anyway. They had already got 2 young African-American men. I had no resources. All right, so that was like a conviction for them.
I spoke to one of Anthony's attorneys, Nicole Casares, who steps into Anthony's story later on in this episode. She said that Cookie told her that Carter believed that if he gave Anthony's name that day, that Anthony would have an alibi, and that the charges against him wouldn't stick. Anthony's brother, sister, and girlfriend told the police that they were all together at Anthony's mother's apartment in the nearby town of Brenham when the crime was committed, supposedly sometime after 1 a.m. The Texas Rangers lacked any physical evidence that placed Anthony at the scene of the crime. They never searched his mother's apartment where he was arrested, and they couldn't find a motive for him either. After days of questioning, Anthony still hadn't admitted to having any knowledge about the murders. Despite the cold trail, the Texas Rangers moved forward, and in September 1992, they charged both Robert Carter and Anthony Graves with 6 counts of capital murder. According to Pamela Koloff, Anthony grew up with his younger brother and sister in the housing projects in Brenham. Their mother raised the kids on her own, and as the oldest, Anthony took care of his siblings and things around the house when his mom was at work. Anthony was always well-liked. His warm disposition and big smile carried him through his classes and socially with his friends, and he was popular with girls. He loved baseball and met his lifelong best friend through the sport. By the time he was 17, he was the father of 2 children. His own absent father was shot and killed soon after. Anthony worked a couple of different jobs, but when he was 21, he was arrested for selling pot and cocaine. He pled guilty and served 120 days. After that, he started working as a machine operator at Magnetic Instruments, a manufacturing company. One day, he had a confrontation with a coworker, and he pulled out a knife before the situation was diffused. When his potential for violence was brought up later in the courts, this was often the situation referenced by the prosecution. Let's get back to September of 1992. Meanwhile, at the county jail in Caldwell, Texas, Anthony and Carter sat in cells directly opposite of each other. A couple of days after they were arrested in September of 1992, Anthony and Carter were both brought before a grand jury. When it was Carter's turn to take the stand, he told the courtroom that he didn't know anything about the murders. He also admitted that he had just thrown Anthony's name out there after the Rangers insisted he name an accomplice. A couple months later, it was time for the bond hearing. The state gathered a string of witnesses, 2 of which were a sheriff's deputy and a jailer. They both claimed that they overheard conversations between the men in the county jail, and that Anthony made statements of guilt to Carter. A longtime friend of Anthony's had hired and paid for the best defense attorney he knew, Dick DeGuerin from Houston. DeGuerin went head-to-head against every one of the state's claims in this bond hearing, and successfully argued that none of these witness testimonies were credible. Still, things didn't look good for Anthony. After all, this was one of the most gruesome, high-profile murder cases that the area had ever seen. Anthony was denied bond, so he stayed in the county jail until his trial started 2 years later. In the meantime, the prosecution and defense teams assembled, and longtime District Attorney Charles Sebesta represented the face of the prosecution. But without DeGuerin, Anthony didn't have a private attorney anymore, so the court appointed a defense team to represent Anthony. Carter's trial was up first, and the evidence against him was clear. He'd admitted to lying about the lawnmower fire, and he said he was at the scene of the murders. Investigators had matched the bullets found at his home with the ones removed from 16-year-old Nicole Davis's body. Plus, he didn't have an alibi, except from the word of his wife, Cookie, who police had also charged in relation to the murders. A jury found Carter guilty of capital murder, and they sentenced him to death. But Anthony's trial wasn't as straightforward as Carter's. Sebesta made a deal with one of Carter's attorneys. If Carter testified against Anthony, he would have a chance to save his own life, to change his sentence from the death penalty to life in prison. Carter agreed to the deal. He would testify against Anthony. And in October of 1994, the state of Texas versus Anthony Graves officially began. Carter was the star witness in Anthony's case, and the prosecution was praying that Carter would follow through and testify against Anthony on the stand, like he had agreed to. But Carter was unpredictable. He had changed his story countless times, often introducing bizarre details that he had never even mentioned before. The prosecution visited him in jail the night before Anthony's trial. According to journalist Pamela Koloff's story in Texas Monthly, Carter immediately blurted out, "I did it all myself, Mr. Sebesta. I did it all myself." But Sebesta didn't believe him. And Sebesta told Pamela Koloff later that when he pushed back that night, Carter changed his story again. This time he said that his wife, Cookie, had used a hammer to hit several of the victims, while he and Anthony killed the rest of the family. But Carter refused to testify against his wife. So Sebesta made another deal with him, that they wouldn't question him about Cookie as long as he still testified against Anthony. Sebesta and the prosecution never told the defense about Carter's claim from the night before, that he admitted to murdering 6 people single-handedly. But the law stated that any exculpatory evidence, meaning anything that could reveal that a person found guilty actually wasn't guilty, had to be handed over to the defense. Sebesta didn't do that. But the trial went on, and prosecutors introduced a shaky piece of evidence against Anthony, a souvenir knife that one of Anthony's friends, Roy Reuter, had given him a few months before the murders. Roy was the same friend that I mentioned earlier, the one who had paid for Anthony's defense attorney during his bond hearing. Roy had an identical knife, and he turned it over to the Texas Rangers for the investigation. Roy thought there was no way investigators would pin the flimsy, low-quality blade as the murder weapon. But the knife was a major win for the prosecution, and they called Robert Bayardo as a witness. Bayardo was the medical examiner for Travis County, which is the county of the state's capital, Austin, a little more than 90 miles west of Somerville. Bayardo examined the 6 bodies and presented the knife to the jury, explaining that a knife with that type of blade could have been the murder weapon. What needs to be noted here is that Bayardo was the same man who was appointed to examine the medical evidence in the case of Rodney Reed. If you listen to the last 2 episodes about Rodney's case, you'll know that Bayardo has a history of inaccurate conclusions. Bayardo not only worked on Anthony and Rodney's cases, both from outside of Travis County, but also the case of Michael Morton, a Central Texas man who was wrongfully imprisoned for his wife's murder. Bayardo performed the autopsy on Morton's wife, who was also murdered outside of Travis County. Morton was exonerated in 2011 after nearly 25 years in prison. These are 3 cases from outside of Bayardo's jurisdiction, 2 of which are proven to have resulted in wrongful death row convictions. After Bayardo testified in Anthony's trial, 4 additional witnesses were called. Each of them spoke to overhearing conversations between Anthony and Carter in jail when they were held in cells across from one another. The defense poked holes in each of their testimonies, establishing that these weren't guilt-convincing witnesses. Then it was time for the defense's witnesses. So they called a different local medical examiner to the stand, who claimed that the injuries that killed the Davis family could have actually been caused by any single-edged knife. But after a key witness refused to testify, the defense couldn't establish Anthony's alibi, that he was at home with his siblings on the night of the murders. Even though his brother confirmed Anthony's location at his mom's apartment that night, their sister was never asked to testify and confirm the story. With so many holes and the falling through of witness testimonies, the defense was losing the battle. The prosecutor Sebesta took the upper hand, hitting home how Anthony owned a knife and how Carter had placed him at the scene of the murders. It was time for the verdict. 12 long hours passed, and the jury re-entered the room. The only black person on the jury stood up to read the decision. Guilty.
And when I heard them read that guilty verdict, I just said to myself, this is just the beginning. You're not just going to take my life for something I don't know anything about. You're not going to convince me that I'm some bad person when I'm not. So I don't care what you tell in society. I'm going to tell them the truth, you know. And if the truth will prevail, then I'll be okay. But but at this time, I'm pissed and I'm upset and I'm disappointed enough that I want to make a difference, because I'm not the first person that this happened to. I've read this in our history books, okay, too many times, and now here I am.
Once Anthony was found guilty, the next steps were almost inevitable. Robert Carter had already been sentenced to death, so it only made sense that the prosecutors would pursue the same punishment for Anthony. They used the brutality of the crime against him.
I ended up being wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death. I spent the next 12 and a half years on death row. I experienced 2 execution dates. I witnessed over 415 people being murdered around me.
Carter and Anthony were both headed to death row. Carter's wife, Cookie, would walk free. The charges against her were dropped due to a lack of evidence. Anthony and Carter were immediately sent to death row on the Ellis Unit, a maximum security prison in Huntsville, Texas, about 70 miles north of Houston. Before 1999, this is where all male death row inmates in Texas lived out the rest of their days before they were executed. But Anthony wasn't completely alone. He shared a cell with another inmate there, and he tried to make his life feel as normal as possible.
I worked on the work program. You can come out, play basketball together, play chess in the day room and all of those things.
But one day in 1998, 6 inmates cut a hole through the fence and escaped, starting a manhunt around Huntsville. 6 months later, every inmate was moved to the Alan B. Polunsky Unit in Livingston, a small town on the edge of the East Texas piney woods. Anthony was immediately placed in solitary confinement, where he spent the next 12 years of his life. He had been in the work program at the Ellis Unit, where he made garments with other death row inmates who were considered to have good behavior. That job, the cellmate, the recreation yard, it all went away. The Polunsky was a different beast altogether.
So you have a situation where you in a cage that is 4 walls, basically, that 6x9 cage that feels like the walls are closing in on you every day. Total isolation. Total isolation.
And this type of environment is, it wreaks havoc on people's mental health and their physical well-being.
After talking to Anthony, I wanted to know more about prison conditions in Texas. So I reached out to an expert, Michelle Deitch. She's a professor and the director of the Prison and Jail Innovation Lab at the University of Texas at Austin. It's a policy resource center focused on creating safer, more humane living environments for people in custody. She spent over 35 years working on issues related to criminal justice reform and prison conditions.
So on Polunsky, everyone on death row is incarcerated in a solitary confinement type setting where they are locked up in their cells 23 plus hours a day. They're given less than an hour a day for a shower or for some recreation time. Recreation time is on a solitary basis, and it is basically an opportunity to move around in a slightly larger cage. It's a very deprived setting. They don't come into contact with fellow prisoners. Interactions with staff take place through a slot in the door where their food gets handed through.
Michelle started her career as a court-appointed monitor in the Texas prison systems. She routinely went inside to meet with incarcerated people and observe the prison conditions, and then report everything she saw back to the federal court. She said it taught her a lot about what's actually going on inside, what Anthony went through every day.
It's just everything is negative in your life on death row, on Polunsky. All the rules are negative, and they use it and they say it's for security reasons. But it's also just because, as an officer once told me, when I say, man, why do you come back here and mess with people the way you do? He said, I do that, Mr. Gray, because I feel like I'm doing society a favor. That's the approach to a prisoner on death row and on Polunsky unit. The approach is to feel like you're doing society a favor. And that means that you're being as hard as you can on these inmates back here.
Anthony told me that the mental anguish was almost unbearable.
Because you're being told every day that you did something that you know you didn't do, but could you have done it and been asleep and done it? I mean, these are things that you start thinking. Could I have just been sleepwalking and done something and don't know I did it? No, I didn't. Maybe? Nah, I know I ain't did nothing, but they're telling me I did something? No, I ain't do that. I ain't that type of person. Could somebody have drugged me and made me do that? No. You start to, you're trying to figure this out. Why are they saying you did something? You know you didn't do nothing, but did somebody do something to you to make you do something? You don't, you start playing with your own mind because you need to figure out and justify why your life is like this right now. And if not, it can drive you crazy. I sit down there for 6,640 days trying to understand why me. Why me? I mean, did I? No, I couldn't. I have asked myself 100 times down there, could I have been asleep? Could somebody? Because you didn't do nothing, but you're trying to justify it some kind of way. Could it just been somebody look like me? I mean, but no, it's the system. No, they got it wrong.
Michelle told me that solitary confinement exacerbates any mental health conditions that an inmate might already have, and it can lead to hallucinations or breaks from reality.
They lose their ability to communicate effectively. They don't know how to socially interact with fellow human beings. But a lot of people really decompensate psychologically, and many of them fall into depressions or experience psychological breaks. There's a high rate of suicide attempts in that setting.
When Katie and I interviewed Anthony, we couldn't believe how openly he discussed his time on death row. It was so hard to reckon the cheerful, smiling man in front of me with the man he told me he was in that cell.
And I always ask people, so tell me what has been your worst nightmare, your worst dream, your worst thought? Because that's what they're living every day. That's their reality. Your worst dream, your worst nightmare is their reality every day. And people don't hold on every day. They do not. I heard young men crying. I heard young men screaming out in the middle of the night while they're cutting their throat and trying to write the blood on the wall. They did not do this. I heard young men just going crazy, banging their head on steel doors. I've seen young men just drop their appeals. They just wanted to be dead. They couldn't deal with the conditions anymore. You know, I've seen young men just walk around like zombies, checked out, and they just fill them up with Therazine medication and they just walk around. And they're dead already. They're incoherent. They're just out of there. This is the reality of death row. Every day, I can tell you, I witness young men literally, just going insane. 22, 23 years old. Seen them when they was 18, very coherent, coming there. 20, 22, babbling incoherent, going totally insane. And you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna still execute it. After we've driven them insane, we're gonna still execute. So that's what the death penalty does. The death penalty, they take you down there and they literally drive you insane for several years, and then they execute you. And for those who are trying to hold on and witnessing that every day, find themselves also slipping. It's a slippery slope to mental instability on death row, whether you're innocent or not. You know, it is the hardest thing I've ever had to do in my life, was to wake up and realize I'm on death row for a crime I didn't commit. And I'm witnessing the state that I love kill all these men. Men that I now know to be just men. Nothing special to them. No reason for us to just have to kill them. Men with their own problems. Men who have been abused, who now abuse someone else and they're on death row for it. Men who are mentally ill, who couldn't represent themselves and now they're on death row. I've seen so much down there that told me that I'm here to be a messenger. A messenger, a bridge between the outside and what's happening in here, because there's no reason for me to be here otherwise, because men are literally going insane. And I didn't want to be one of them.
How did you, I mean, not to be like indelicate, but how did you not go insane? Like how did you, you seem very well adjusted now.
Yeah. You know, and I mean, it's a good question, because I have tried to figure that out myself. I think for me, though, to be totally honest, is that I really dug in on my belief in God, because that's all I had. It's all I had, and I couldn't afford to give it up, because if I did, I had nothing left, nothing to cling any hope to, you know? So I had gotten to that point where it was like, okay, God, I've been believing in you all this time. I didn't know why. My family have always told me to believe in you, so I have. But if you real, I need you now, right? If it's any time I need you now, because I can't do this. I can't do it. I'm just a man. There's so many days I woke up, so many nights I went to bed, didn't want to wake up. I cried myself to sleep. Why am I here? I'm 26 years old. Best part of my life. And I'm on death row? And now I'm 36 and I'm still on death row? And I'm 40 and I'm on death row? For something I know nothing about? But because I kind of put it all, and this is just real, because I kind of put it all in God's hand, I was able to now start seeing it from a broader perspective.
Like you heard Katie mention in her question to Anthony, he really does seem well-adjusted given everything he's been through. But Michelle told me that even though people can transition to life outside of death row, the scars never fully heal.
human beings are social creatures. We need to interact with other people. It's how we learn about ourselves. It's how we learn about the world. It's how we make meaning in the places around us. And not having an opportunity to interact with people, you lose sense of time. You lose sense of what's happening in the world. You forget how to interact. And for someone who is ultimately found innocent and is released from death row, they don't recover from that. That is a lifelong harm that we've done to them.
I've been the exception, not the rule, right? Everything has been, as they say, peachy keen, hunky-dory with me as I started to speak. But, I had some challenges when I first came out, dealing with PTSD, not understanding that it was PTSD. To find myself very sensitive on serious topics. I could never hold a serious conversation without tearing up, that lasted for a while. I just felt so disconnected out here because I hadn't been out here in 18 and a half years. So, I didn't know if I could make it at times. People used to see me smiling, but they never saw me crying in the middle of the night.
In January of 2023, as I was working on this podcast, 4 condemned men on Texas death row sued the state of Texas, and they're asking for the case to cover the entire death row population at Polunsky. The lawsuit states that, quote, extended isolation deprives prisoners of their right to access medical care and attorneys, and causes severe physical and psychological harm. Texas prisoners, whether they're on the row or not, have a constitutional right to access medical care and an attorney. What type of complaints about medical care are usually common?
Access to care, being able to be seen by medical staff if you've got a complaint about your health. Even if you do get to see a medical person, having them take your complaint seriously, making sure that they give you appropriate treatment for whatever is identified. A lot of times people complain that they can't get in the first place, and if they do get in, their complaints are dismissed or they're just given an aspirin as opposed to looking to see whether there's something more serious going on.
Michelle also talked to me about the temperature inside the walls. The brutality of a Texas summer hits hard, and less than half the system is air-conditioned.
So during the summer months, the hot summer months, the temperatures are absolutely excruciating, and the airflow is very minimal. People experience tremendous heat extremes. They can't cool down. The temperature in the cell blocks can easily get to well over 100 degrees, much higher than that. And there have been cases of people who have died from heat stroke and such before.
I asked Michelle how she would respond to people saying that convicted prisoners deserve the type of experience that they receive in Texas prisons, that they don't deserve anything better than the very worst for the crimes they've committed.
I certainly understand where that instinct's coming from. I mean, these people are convicted of really horrible crimes, and I understand the anger, the feeling that they don't deserve good treatment. The question to me is not so much what they deserve, it's what do we deserve to do to someone? Who are we that we get to say you're not entitled to human rights? Or who do we want to be as a society that we could treat people so horrifically, that we could lock them in cages for 20-something years, that we could cause people's mental health to deteriorate or their physical health to deteriorate? That's not for us to decide. We, as a society, ought to take whatever steps are necessary to treat people correctly. And if that is the appropriate punishment for them, that they should be executed, that's the punishment. It's not what happens to them in between. It's not for us to impose that.
Kind of just like from an ethical question, like how do we then, like who gets to call the shots on justice? And like why as a society, why can't we do that as a society? Tough question.
Again, I think it comes back to who do we want to be as a people? What does this reflect about us and about our own humanity? How we treat people who are incarcerated is a reflection of who we are and who we want to be. It should be our best selves coming out, not our worst selves. That's what we're punishing in these people, but it's our worst selves that are coming out when we treat them that way.
Anthony felt similarly.
And for those that believe in that type of punishment, I just want you to know that it's barbaric, it's inhumane, it's literally driving people insane. And if you're okay with that, then pat yourself on the back because job well done. That is what's happening. You are literally driving your neighbor insane before you killing him for something that you think he may or may not have done. So congratulations, you have accomplished your goal.
Before he was executed in May of 2000, Carter spoke openly about Anthony's innocence and his own guilt. His high school English teacher and her husband started visiting him regularly and writing him letters. They were evangelical Christians, and they encouraged him to seek forgiveness. So Carter started writing letters, some to his attorneys, some even to the remaining members of the Davis family. He sought out conversations with fellow inmates, and he freely confessed that he had pinned the murders upon an innocent man. Less than 2 weeks before he was executed, Carter sat before Anthony's defense team and the prosecutor, Sebesta. Under oath, he explained to the group how he drove to the Davis house alone that night to kill his son. He spoke in detail about how he carried out all 5 of the other murders that night too. No one else had helped him. He also said that he tried to tell Sebesta and the Rangers this back when he was first brought to jail. I spoke to journalist Pamela Koloff about her incredible long-form story that's about Anthony, Carter, and the deaths of the Davis family. In this Texas Monthly piece called Innocence Lost, she recounts the day that Carter was executed. She writes that inside the execution chamber, the remaining members of the Davis family stood behind a panel of plexiglass. When asked if he had any last words, Carter turned and looked at them and said, quote, "I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused your family. It was me and me alone. Anthony Graves had nothing to do with it. I lied on him in court. I'm ready to go home and be with my Lord." But even after Carter confessed under oath and was executed, Anthony sat on death row for 6 more years.
All because of a system that once you put in it, it's designed to convict, and in the case of the death penalty, kill you. There's no checks and balances to say, let's go back and check to make sure this is the right person. Everything is geared toward rubber stamping to kill you. From the appeal process on up, everybody's in line to rubber stamp your case. That's the system that we have in place, and that's what we need to start really talking about, because it's the infrastructure that's failing us. Because we're so hell bent on building up our infrastructure, investing into our systems, that we have forgotten to invest into people. Won't be all of this going back and forth. Because what we're doing now, we're fighting the truth against the system in order to create a more perfect system, right? Because that's how we get to a better system, is to learn from the mistakes we make. But if we don't want to acknowledge those mistakes, if we want to bury those mistakes and create false narratives around cases, then no longer are we talking about seeking justice, right? We're talking about seeking convictions and trying to uphold them in any way, in any fashion that we can. And that's where we are today. We're seeking convictions and we're no longer seeking justice, because our system is so polluted with politics that the only way to get ahead in this system is you have to have that resume for being tough on crime. And it's at the expense of innocent people who can't afford justice.
There are currently 184 inmates on Texas death row. Half of them are Black, even though only 12% of Texas's population is Black. When it comes to legal representation in prison, the more money you have, the better attorney you can afford to hire. And for incarcerated people who can't pay that bill, or who don't have families to help them out, they're assigned a public defender. This is exactly what happened in Anthony's case, and these court-appointed attorneys are notorious for often being overworked and underpaid. It's easy to put two and two together. Affluent people, who are usually white, can afford to pay for the best attorney, but people of color are arrested and convicted at disproportionately higher rates. So it's less common for them to have the resources to pay a high-level attorney.
I was in that system. I witnessed that system killing 415 people around me. I mean, people I knew, watching them grow up. Most of them were guilty. Some of them were innocent. A lot of them had mental illness issues. And they were all meeting the same fate. The state was killing everybody, sometimes twice a day, because it was their system at work. We're killing our neighbors. We're killing our best friends. We're killing our mothers. We're killing our children. We're killing our fathers. We're killing Black people. We're killing white people. We're killing Hispanics. We've gone crazy. And it's a system that is allowing us to look this inhumane. It's not us. It's the system that we've created.
Executions in Texas have a long and complicated history. Individual counties were responsible for hanging their prisoners until 1923. Then, the state took responsibility for executions after the introduction of the electric chair. 361 people were electrocuted by the state of Texas. In 1977, Texas changed its execution method to lethal injection. This means that convicts are strapped to a chair and a deadly dosage of pentobarbital is placed into their arm. The drug is a barbiturate, meant to depress the central nervous system. In a high dosage, like the one used in executions, it will stop a person's heart. The process usually takes less than 10 minutes, but botched executions are common. 2 years after Robert Carter's execution, Anthony still sat on death row. But a new lawyer stepped on the scene who would change everything. A Texas court had ruled that Anthony did indeed have a fair trial, despite Carter's confessions that he'd lied. And unless new evidence was found, there wasn't a clear path forward or hope for a retrial. But a new lawyer stepped on the scene who would change everything for Anthony. In the fall of 2002, attorney Nicole Cazares was teaching journalism at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. She heard about Anthony's case, and she recruited a group of journalism students. They started digging. Together, they circled back to every person that knew anything about the case, collecting affidavits and tracking new information. They stumbled upon a clip from 2 years before. It was a video of the prosecutor, Sebesta, being interviewed about the case. He admitted on camera that right before Carter testified at Anthony's trial, he had told Sebesta that he had acted alone. When Nicole and her team found the clip, they knew it could be enough to catch the attention of the federal courts. And it turned out to be the smoking gun that would eventually lead to Anthony's exoneration. Carter was the only witness, and that only witness had gone back on his testimony and told Sebesta that he acted alone. But Sebesta hid this exculpatory evidence, and that breached Anthony's constitutional rights. But it takes time for these changes to move through the legal system. In this case, years. It was 2006 at this point, and Nicole officially joined Anthony's defense team. She continued to work without any form of compensation. Anthony still sat on death row.
The international human rights community, through various international instruments, human rights instruments, has declared that more than 15 days in solitary confinement constitutes torture. And here we lock people in that setting for years on end. I've met people personally who are locked up in solitary confinement for more than 20 years, much longer than that. That is, by any standard, torture. And again, that's in comparison to 15 days under international human rights law.
It all rested on a final decision of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. And in March of 2006, the court overturned Anthony's conviction. They criticized Sebesta for refusing to disclose Carter's confession that he lied about Anthony's involvement. In September of 2006, Anthony left death row for the first time in 12 years. But he went straight from his solitary cell in Livingston to a county jail cell in Burleson County, which is where the murders occurred. He still had to be retried. What followed was a complicated reshuffling of prosecutors and defense attorneys. The prosecution wanted to seek the death penalty against Anthony again. And Anthony didn't feel hopeful about his chances this time. 4 more years passed. It's hard to even comprehend or put into words the total amount of time that Anthony had spent incarcerated at this point. 24 hours in a day, 365 days in a year, 18 years.
And then October 27, 2010, I was exonerated. I was released from jail that day. All charges against me dismissed. Prosecutor saying that I was totally innocent. I got out. 6 months later, I was fully exonerated and compensated.
After 18 years, Anthony was free. He was 45 years old at that point, and he had a lot of life to catch up on.
I developed relationships out here, positive people been in my life. I created a positive circle around me. And then I've taken what I've already knew and I made it my life work so that I had some familiarity in my life. This is why I do the work that I do, because I started it back there. And coming out here, I knew that I needed it to hold on, that this gave me familiarity. And so, but now I'm married. I'm married to my wife. We've been married over 4 years. I'm in a good place. I have grandkids. I love my grandkids. I built up great relationships with them. I built relationships with the community. I have a great relationship with my co-workers. I have relationships with government now. I'm working on the other side of the law. Go figure.
It would have been easy for Anthony to walk out of that cell in the Burleson County Jail and never even think of setting foot in a prison again. In 2011, he was awarded $1.4 million as compensation for his time on death row. And in 2015, former District Attorney Sebesta was disbarred for his errors and illegal actions in Anthony's case. Maybe some form of justice had finally been served. maybe Anthony could close the chapter and never look back. But he's made it his life's purpose to make sure that what happened to him doesn't happen to anyone else. So he goes back, time and time again, to jails and prisons across Texas.
I work here at the Harris County Public Defender's Office. I created a project called Peer Navigators. And what I do is I employ formerly incarcerated people and train them on how to go back and support our clients that are incarcerated and educate their family members through the whole criminal process.
Today, Anthony speaks at panels and testifies in court hearings to fight against the failures of the system that almost killed him. He mentors a group of incarcerated men every week. They talk about how to navigate the criminal justice system together. Sometimes he helps attorneys advocate for death row inmates in wrongful conviction cases and helps fight for their lives. He regularly visits Texas prisons and encourages full rooms of incarcerated people with the message, "Live till you die."
What I do today helps me get something out of it and makes sense why I went through this. Because had I just came out and just tried to live a normal life, I'd probably be going crazy. Because nothing would still make sense to me, you know. But doing what I do now, helping someone like after Dwayne Brown walk off of death row, helping another man get his sentence commuted, you know, going down there and being a navigator for other men, it makes sense to me. Okay, you were put in this place to make a difference, Anthony, and move like that, right? So I just took it upon myself to say, this is what it's about. So I need to learn everything I can learn, help people when I can, and get out here and share this with the rest of the world. And that's what I did. So much so that they didn't call me Anthony down there. They started calling me Brother Graves, and I wasn't no Christian or nothing. But because my message was always of hope, of this too shall pass, of live till you die. That the message was inspirational to where, hey, I have the right to live till I die. Regardless of what they're saying they're gonna do to me, I still have that right. But the most important thing I think at the end of the day is our mindset. What do we want our justice system to look like? What is justice to us? How do we get there? I think those questions need to be answered before we start trying to shape or reshape the infrastructure of it all. The mindset has to change. It can no longer be a biased mindset against people you think may have done something or may not have done something. It has to be, what does justice look like to you? And how do we move to achieve it? Because I think when we can define what justice really is, then we can begin to build an infrastructure around it.
This episode was hosted, reported, and produced by me, Aisling Ayers. A special thanks to Pamela Koloff, whose reporting for Texas Monthly led to Anthony's charges being dropped and his final release.
I'm Katie Pichagautka, and I'm the executive producer. The associate producers for this episode are Cameron Greiser and Mackenzie Matwick. Our cover art was created by Alexa Georgelos. Sophia Vargas-Karam is the Drag's marketing and communications manager. The Drag's executive producers are Heather Stewart and Lainey Steinhardt. A huge thank you to Leslie Schrock for all of her support and guidance. This podcast is presented by the Drag Audio Production House, which is a part of Texas Student Media at the University of Texas at Austin's Moody College of Communication. This podcast was funded in part thanks to support from Arnold Ventures. Special thanks to the University of Texas School of Journalism and Media and Texas Student Media. Also to Robert Quigley, Rachel Davis Mercy, Kathleen McElroy, and Gerald Johnson. The Drag is a nonprofit educational organization that is made possible by individual donations. Please support our work by going to thedragaudio.com/donate. Every dollar goes directly to producing more content like this while giving students an amazing educational experience. Thanks for listening.